26 years in law enforcement, and I thought I'd seen it all. Murder scenes, domestic violence calls that went too far, drug deals gone wrong. The usual catalog of human cruelty that comes with working homicide in New Hampshire. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for the call that came in at 4:03 a.m. on October 4th, 2009. The shrill ring of my department phone cut through the pre-dawn silence of my office. I was pulling an all-nighter, catching up on case files, when dispatch patched through what would become the most horrific case of my career. Detective Morrison, we've got a situation on Trow Road, Mont Vernon. Possible home invasion, 1 adult female deceased, 1 juvenile critical. First responders are on scene. Mont Vernon. Population 2,000. The kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, and the biggest crime was usually teenagers drinking beer in the woods. A place where evil wasn't supposed to exist.
I'll be perfectly honest, I wanted to kill someone for a long time. It's like an urge, and it was kind of a time that I could get it out.
You are that sick fuck.
Steve was pretty much excited. It definitely wasn't his first time. It was like, yeah, it's awesome, you'll get used to it, Chris. It gets addicting, but we'll take care of it.
Those words, I wanted to kill someone for a long time, would haunt me for years to come. But I'm getting ahead of myself. When I first arrived at 4 Trow Road that October morning, I had no idea I was about to encounter the work of what these monsters called themselves, the Disciples of Destruction. The drive to Mont Vernon took exactly 14 minutes through the winding back roads of southern New Hampshire. 14 minutes for my mind to race through possibilities, none of which came close to the reality waiting for me. As I turned onto Trow Road, the strobing red and blue lights from 4 patrol units cut through the darkness like emergency beacons warning of the horror ahead.
I'm one of those type of gentlemanly chivalry sort of guys that you don't even hit girls, let alone go out and treat them badly. If the girl's in the hospital, obviously she probably got injured or something.
Well, Chris, it's funny you should mention that, because I want to let you know she is going to survive, fortunately.
That's good.
Yeah, that is real good.
Even now, knowing what I know about Christopher Gribble, the cold-blooded killer who spoke those words, the calculated manipulation in his voice still makes my skin crawl. The way he presented himself as someone who would never hurt a girl while sitting across from me just hours after he had brutally attacked an 11-year-old child with a knife. But let me start at the beginning with the family that would become the center of this nightmare. Mont Vernon is home to about 2,000 residents and has long been renowned for its tranquil atmosphere and virtually non-existent crime rate. No one could have imagined that this peaceful town would become the scene of one of the nation's most shocking murder cases. Among the community lived the Cates family, 42-year-old Kimberly, her husband David, and their outgoing 11-year-old daughter Jaimie. They lived on Trow Road, where towering trees created a peaceful residential canopy. I had reviewed the family's background before arriving at the scene. The Cates were what we in law enforcement call clean. No criminal history, no domestic disturbances, no connection to drugs or any criminal element. Kimberly worked as a pediatric nurse at the local hospital, dedicating her life to helping sick children. David was an engineer, a methodical man who traveled occasionally for work. And Jaimie, bright, outgoing, 11 years old, was everything a parent could hope for in a daughter. They represented everything good about small-town America, which made what happened to them all the more incomprehensible. It wasn't unusual for David to take occasional business trips, leaving Kimberly and Jaimie at home. To safeguard against emergencies, he had installed a security system that would alert local authorities if triggered. Additionally, Kimberly had arranged with a neighbor to watch each other's property when needed. Given the town's low crime rate, no one ever suspected that Trow Road homes might become targets. The alarm system. That detail would eat at me for months. David Cates had done everything a responsible husband and father should do. Installed a security system, arranged for neighbors to watch the house, took every reasonable precaution. But sometimes, reasonable precautions aren't enough when you're dealing with unreasonable evil. Before David left on a Saturday, October 3rd, 2009 assignment, the home's alarm system suddenly malfunctioned, rendering it inoperable. Despite this glitch, The family remained unconcerned and went about their plans. As David closed the door behind him for another work trip, he had no inkling that his world was about to be shattered. Murphy's Law in its cruelest form. The one weekend the alarm system fails is the weekend 4 teenagers decide to break into their home. I've seen coincidences in my career that would make you question whether fate exists, but this wasn't fate. This was just horrible timing that enabled horrible people to do horrible things. That weekend had begun like any other for the mother and daughter, who planned to shop at the local mall the next day and possibly stop by Jaimie's karate studio. Kimberly messaged David these details before they went to bed around 8:30 p.m., letting him know Jaimie would sleep in their bedroom as usual. From his hotel room in Maryland, David texted a goodnight wish at approximately 11 p.m. Those last text messages between David and his family would later become crucial evidence, establishing the timeline and proving that this was a random attack. The killers had no way of knowing David was out of town. Kimberly's messages were full of mundane details: shopping plans, karate practice, the everyday rhythms of a normal family life. Jaimie sleeping in her parents' bedroom was a detail that would save her life. If she had been in her own room, the attackers might have found her first, alone and vulnerable. Instead, her mother's protective instincts kicked in immediately when the attack began. At 4 a.m. on October 4th, 2009, the emergency dispatch center received a call that would shake our entire department to its core. I've heard a lot of 911 calls in my career, panicked, angry, desperate. But the call from 4 Trow Road was different. It was the sound of innocents being murdered. At 4 a.m. on October 4th, 2009, a chilling 911 call reached the local dispatcher. The voice on the line was that of a young girl, soft, faint, and nearly unintelligible. What the dispatcher could discern were the terrified sobs of a child begging for help. Unable to understand her words fully, the dispatcher immediately sent an officer to 4 Trow Road. I've listened to that 911 call hundreds of times. Each time, it gets harder, not easier. The dispatcher, Sarah Martinez, a veteran with 15 years of experience handling emergency calls, later told me she had nightmares for months. The voice was so small, so broken, that Sarah had to strain to understand what Jaimie was trying to say through her injuries and terror. "Help me, they hurt my mom. Please help." Those fragmented words, barely audible above Jaimie's labored breathing, were all the dispatch center needed to send every available unit to Trow Road. Upon arrival, the officer quickly surveyed the exterior while awaiting backup. Before he could circle the house, he noticed a sudden movement through a kitchen window. Peering inside, he saw a small figure hiding behind the counter and locking eyes with him. Overcome with horror, he recognized the girl lying on the floor, covered in blood, with part of her foot severed. Officer Jake Russo was the first responder. A 10-year veteran of the force, Jake had seen car accidents, domestic violence, overdoses, the usual catalog of small-town tragedy. But nothing had prepared him for what he saw through that kitchen window. Jake later described it to me as looking into hell itself. A child, barely alive, lying in a pool of blood, her small body bearing wounds that no human being should ever have to endure. The fact that she was conscious, that she was looking back at him with those terrified eyes, made it even worse. Realizing the child was grievously injured, the officer forced the front door and entered. There, he found the girl trembling and paralyzed by fear. She struggled to scream, but no sound emerged. When she finally managed to speak, she identified herself as Jaimie and begged him not to leave her side as he carried her outside. Jake's training kicked in immediately. Secure the scene, assess for additional victims, call for medical assistance. But his human side was screaming. He told me later that carrying Jaimie out of that house was the hardest thing he'd ever done in his career. Not because of her physical condition, though that was horrific enough, but because of what she whispered to him as he lifted her up. "Please don't let them come back. Please don't leave me alone." An 11-year-old girl, barely clinging to life, more worried about being abandoned than about her own injuries. It takes a special kind of courage to maintain that level of trust in adults after what she had just experienced. The officer comforted Jaimie, promising that she was safe while he searched for other victims inside. Outside, another officer arrived and saw that Jaimie had multiple lacerations on her head, legs, arms, and torso in addition to her severed foot. When questioned, she said some man had a knife and another had a bat, and he hit my mom. Though unable to identify her attackers, she recalled one was bald and overheard someone say, "Take the jewelry." She added that she survived by pretending to be dead. Some guy had a knife and another one had a bat. Even in her traumatized state, Jaimie was providing crucial evidence. Multiple attackers, weapons of opportunity, and the chilling detail that would prove this was a robbery. Get the jewelry. But it was her survival strategy that truly amazed me. Playing dead. An 11-year-old girl, in the most terrifying moments of her life, had the presence of mind to play dead to save herself. Most adults would have panicked, screamed, tried to run. Jaimie made a calculated decision that saved her life. The fact that one attacker was bald would later prove crucial in identifying Steven Spader, who had recently shaved his head. Additional units soon joined, and officers followed blood-stained footprints across the carpet to the master bedroom. What they found inside could only be described as a chamber of horror, with blood covering nearly every inch of the room. No member of law enforcement was prepared for the sheer volume of gore that awaited them. I've processed over 200 homicide scenes in my career. I thought I had developed the psychological armor necessary to handle violent crime. But walking into that master bedroom destroyed every defense mechanism I had built over 26 years in law enforcement. The blood spatter analysis told a story of prolonged, sadistic violence. This wasn't a quick killing. These attackers had taken their time. The patterns on the walls, the cast-off evidence from repeated strikes, the sheer volume of blood loss. Everything pointed to killers who had enjoyed what they were doing. Worse still, on the blood-soaked bed lay Jaimie's mother, Kimberly, brutally murdered. Severely injured, Jaimie was rushed to the hospital, her survival uncertain. Kimberly Cates, 42 years old, pediatric nurse, devoted mother. The medical examiner would later confirm 36 separate machete wounds. 36. Each one a deliberate act of violence. Each one proof that these weren't just killers. They were monsters who took pleasure in inflicting pain. The defensive wounds on her hands and arms told the story of a mother fighting desperately to protect her child. In her final moments, Kimberly Cates had done everything she could to save Jaimie's life. And somehow, miraculously, she had succeeded. Standing in that blood-soaked bedroom, I made a promise to Kimberly Cates that I intended to keep. I would find who did this, and I would make sure they paid for it. Crime scene processing in a case like this is both art and science. Every blood droplet, every disturbed item, every piece of physical evidence tells part of the story. My job was to read that story and translate it into evidence that would hold up in court. In the aftermath, investigators faced a mountain of questions, chief among them the motive behind such a savage attack on a mother and child. Searching the home, they discovered various items of jewelry were missing. They also found a broken basement window, its screen lying neatly below, and the air conditioning unit displaced from its deck window, both potential entry points. The evidence was telling a clear story. This wasn't a random break-in by desperate drug addicts. The basement window had been carefully cut, not smashed. The screen had been removed methodically and placed neatly on the ground. These attackers had planned their entry carefully. The missing air conditioning unit provided a second point of entry. These killers had thought through multiple ways to get into the house. This level of planning suggested premeditation, which would be crucial for securing first-degree murder charges. The stolen jewelry confirmed robbery as a motive, but the level of violence went far beyond what was necessary for theft. Most burglars want to get in and out without confronting homeowners. These attackers had not only encountered the family, but had chosen to engage in prolonged, brutal violence. To the south of the house, tire tracks marked the dirt drive, and muddy footprints appeared in the yard. As news of the brutal assault spread, the tight-knit community was gripped by fear. Rumors traveled from nearby Brookline, only 20 minutes away, fueling the town's terror. Tire tracks and footprints, the physical evidence that would eventually lead us to our suspects. But it was the whispers from Brookline that provided our first real break. In small-town New England, news travels fast, and secrets don't stay secret for long. Within hours of the attack, rumors were spreading through Brookline about local teenagers bragging about committing murder. At first, Most people dismissed these as teenage bravado, the kind of dark humor that young people sometimes use to shock their friends. But as details of the Mont Vernon attack spread through local news, people began to realize that what they had heard might be more than just boastful lies. The call came in around 2 p.m. on October 4th, less than 12 hours after the attack. A Brookline resident contacted our department with information that would break the case wide open. According to one Brookline resident who happened to be visiting friends that Sunday, 2 local young men revealed a sick and twisted secret. They claimed to have just murdered a mother and child while a group of their friends watched. What first sounded like a cruel jest or threat soon proved all too horrifying. The witness was a college student named Marcus who had been hanging out at a friend's house when 2 teenagers he didn't know well started bragging about committing murder. At first, Marcus thought they were joking, the kind of dark humor that some teenagers use to try to seem tough or dangerous. But as the teens provided more and more specific details about the attack, Marcus began to realize they weren't joking. They described breaking into a house on Trow Road, attacking a mother and daughter with knives and a machete, stealing jewelry. Details that hadn't been released to the public yet. Those listening at the gathering sat in stunned disbelief, thinking the story a scare tactic until further gruesome details emerged. Experts noted that such perpetrators might relive the adrenaline of the crime by recounting it to peers. This compulsion could explain their eagerness to share every vile detail. This behavioral pattern, the need to relive and share the experience, is common among certain types of killers. For some, the psychological satisfaction comes not just from the act itself, but from the power they feel when recounting it to others. They enjoy the shock, the fear, the attention. What they don't consider is that bragging about murder is essentially a confession. The psychological phenomenon is called grandiosity, the need to be seen as powerful, dangerous, important. In this case, that grandiosity would be their downfall. Enjoying the shock value of their claims, the pair seemingly believed they had outsmarted police by leaving no evidence. However, they underestimated law enforcement, who swiftly pursued the mysterious youths. They turned out to be 19-year-old Christopher Gribble and 17-year-old Steven Spader. Christopher Gribble and Steven Spader. Those names would become etched in my memory, associated forever with the worst crime I had ever investigated. But at that moment, they were just 2 teenagers who had made the fatal mistake of assuming they were smarter than the system. The witness provided enough detail for us to identify both suspects. Christopher Gribble, 19, Eagle Scout, homeschooled, active in his Mormon church. Steven Spader, 17, troubled background, history of behavioral problems. On the surface, they seemed like an unlikely pair for such a heinous crime. But I've learned that evil doesn't always look like what we expect. While we prepared arrest warrants, I spent hours reviewing the background files on our suspects. Understanding who we were dealing with would be crucial for determining how to approach the interrogations. The day after the crime, both suspects were brought in for questioning. It was surprising that Christopher was singled out first, given his background as a longtime Eagle Scout and devout Mormon aiming to become a missionary. Homeschooled by parents intent on instilling strong values, he had also contributed to his community by building a shed for Brookline's transfer station. Christopher Gribble's file painted a picture of a young man who should have had every advantage in life. Eagle Scout, active church member, homeschooled by devoted parents. On paper, he looked like the kind of kid any parent would be proud of. But I've learned that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones who know how to present a perfect facade. The Boy Scout oath includes promises to be trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. How does someone go from that to participating in brutal murder? Yet Christopher struggled socially, with friends recalling his awkward demeanor and habit of rambling. Social cues were foreign to him, making friendship difficult and earning him a solitary childhood. Social isolation, difficulty reading social cues, problems forming relationships. These are risk factors that forensic psychologists often identify in individuals who later commit violent crimes. Not everyone with these characteristics becomes a criminal, but they can be vulnerabilities that make someone susceptible to negative influences. In Christopher's case, it seemed like his friendship with Steven Spader might have been one of those negative influences. Humans have an innate need for connection, and severe difficulty forming even platonic relationships can signal a personality disorder. Despite this, Christopher pursued a spot in the U.S. Army Cadet Corps in Nashua, New Hampshire, earning academic and conduct honors. Christopher's desire to become a Marine was interesting. Military service attracts people for many reasons, but it also attracts individuals who are drawn to the controlled violence and rigid hierarchy of military life. The fact that he had excelled academically and earned conduct awards suggested that he could function well within structured environments. But it also raised questions about what happened when that structure was removed. Unfortunately, in 2008 he failed that training course, marking the beginning of worrying changes. Friends and family noted his behavior shift around that time, the reasons for which soon became clear. Failure, especially for someone accustomed to success, can be a significant psychological stressor. For individuals with certain personality traits, failure can trigger depression, anger, or a desire to prove oneself through other means. The timing of Christopher's behavioral changes, shortly before his friendship with Steven Spader was rekindled, suggested that his psychological state might have made him more susceptible to criminal influence. Steven Spader's background told a very different story. Christopher and Steven had reconnected after meeting years earlier in the Boy Scouts. Each had personal struggles. Steven was born exposed to drugs due to his mother's addiction during pregnancy. Prenatal drug exposure can have lasting effects on brain development, particularly in areas related to impulse control, decision-making, and emotional regulation. While not deterministic, these factors can increase the risk of behavioral problems later in life. The fact that Steven had been adopted at 5 days old suggested that his birth mother's addiction issues were severe enough to require immediate intervention. Miraculously, Steven was adopted at 5 days old and raised in a loving home where he thrived. Outgoing in childhood, he participated in sports, scouts, and theater, forming friendships easily, until adolescence flipped a switch and he became cold and uncontrollable. The dramatic personality change during adolescence was concerning. While teenage years are naturally a time of emotional volatility and identity formation, Steven's transformation seemed extreme. The description of a switch going off suggested something more significant than typical teenage rebellion. This kind of sudden behavioral change can indicate the onset of mental illness, the influence of drug use, or exposure to trauma. In some cases, it can signal the emergence of antisocial personality traits that were previously masked by childhood dependency and structure. After several tense hours of interrogation, Christopher Gribble finally agreed to continue talking. What he told us next would haunt me for the rest of my career. I've heard confessions before, desperate attempts to minimize guilt, strategic admissions designed to avoid worse charges, even genuine remorse. But what Christopher gave us was something else entirely. A cold, methodical recounting of pure evil. As I sat across from this 19-year-old Eagle Scout, listening to him describe the worst crime I had ever investigated, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about human nature.
Steve and I are very similar. Steven Spader. Both of us grew up with problems in our families. Technically, we're both sociopaths, legally, by neuropsychologists' declaration. There should be a paper in the scripture case in the top drawer of my black dresser that says as much.
Okay.
Christopher's casual mention of being diagnosed as a sociopath was chilling in its matter-of-factness. He spoke about it the way someone might mention having blue eyes or being left-handed, as if it were simply another biographical detail rather than a fundamental defect in his capacity for human empathy. In my experience, most criminals try to downplay their psychological issues, fearing they might be used against them in court. Christopher seemed almost proud of his diagnosis, as if it explained and justified everything that followed.
A few days ago, we decided that we were still low on cash. We couldn't manage to get jobs, and we were going to try and get another robbery. We weren't sure when or how we were going to do it. Saturday morning, when I was with Steve, he told me that him and Billy had been cruising around and had found a house out in Mont Vernon that looked reasonable enough, that it was out in the middle of nowhere, and we were thinking we were going to go in there. When it was just me and him together in the car.
You and him meaning?
Me and Steve.
Okay.
In the car. He said, yeah, we're just going to go in there, grab some stuff. If anybody's there, we're going to kill them, have some fun. I agreed. We could do that. That sounded good.
Have some fun. Those 3 words crystallized everything I needed to know about Christopher Gribble's mindset. This wasn't a robbery that escalated into violence. This was a planned killing disguised as a robbery. The theft was just an excuse to get into a house where they could find victims. The premeditation was clear. They had specifically scouted for an isolated house, planned their approach, and made a conscious decision to kill anyone they encountered. Under New Hampshire law, this level of planning and intent would support first-degree murder charges.
Billy was in on it too. He was all for it. We all had pocket knives. I had found a machete that my father owned, and Steve had mentioned he liked machetes, so I brought it along.
Okay.
And there's a Boy Scout knife, a straight knife, about 4 or 5 inches long.
Okay.
Thin blade. I liked it. It had a very nice handle, and it had a leather case that could go on your belt.
Yep.
So I chose that.
The casual way Christopher described selecting weapons was deeply disturbing. He spoke about the Boy Scout knife with genuine affection, admiring its handle, its case, its appearance. This wasn't someone grabbing whatever was available in a moment of panic. This was someone who took pleasure in the tools of violence. The fact that he had taken his father's machete added another layer of tragedy. This weapon, probably used for yard work or camping, had been perverted into an instrument of murder by someone who had completely lost his moral compass. As Christopher continued his confession, I had to fight to maintain my professional composure. Every detail he provided painted a picture of calculated cruelty that challenged my understanding of human evil.
We looked around for a good entry point where we wouldn't make a lot of noise. We didn't see any alarm systems, so we figured we were probably set. All the doors were locked. We finally found one basement window we thought we could get Billy into if I could get it open.
Yep.
I used the black mechanical assist knife that I own to cut the screens. There were 2 screens between us and the window. And I tried to cut the frame out of the window, but ended up breaking the glass. At which point I basically bashed in the window, not the glass, but I managed to break it off of the handle that was on top holding it down.
Christopher's detailed description of the break-in matched perfectly with the physical evidence we had found at the scene. His matter-of-fact recounting of cutting screens and breaking windows showed a level of technical planning that belied the image of impulsive teenage criminals. What struck me most was his pride in his mechanical problem-solving. He spoke about bypassing the window mechanism with the same tone someone might use to describe fixing a car engine. Focus on the technical challenge rather than the fact that he was breaking into a family's home.
When Steven opened the master bedroom door quietly, he looked in, and he said that there are people, but we thought he said, there's no people. So he started to get a little bit relaxed and started talking. He started to quiet us down. And then he shined the light on the bed, and that's when they woke up.
Okay.
The mother said something like, Jaimie, is that you? Stevie threw the light. He went around to one side of the bed where the girl apparently was sleeping. I started to circle around to the other side in case something happened.
Those words, Jaimie, is that you, would echo in my mind for years. Kimberly Cates' first instinct upon hearing noise in her bedroom was to check on her daughter's welfare. Even in that split second before realizing the mortal danger she was in, her thoughts were of Jaimie's safety. Christopher's description of circling around to the other side showed tactical thinking. These weren't confused teenagers stumbling into a bad situation. They were predators positioning themselves to attack.
The mom sat up in the bed, started asking who was there, what was going on, tried to turn on the lamp and it didn't turn on.
Yep.
And when she did that, Steve started hacking at the bed with the machete.
Okay.
They started screaming because they heard something. Apparently he missed them mostly. But I heard him hit the mom. And so I dove in and stabbed her a few times in the chest. Steve was just hacking away. He totally lost it. I was controlled, but I didn't really feel much of anything.
Yeah, okay.
I thought I would, but I didn't.
Christopher's claim that he didn't really feel much of anything was perhaps the most chilling part of his entire confession. Most people, even criminals, experience some emotional response to violence. Fear, excitement, disgust, regret. Christopher described stabbing a mother in the chest with the emotional detachment of someone discussing their morning commute. His comparison between himself and Steven was also telling. While Steven totally lost it, Christopher remained controlled. In his mind, this made him superior, more professional, more competent. The fact that he took pride in his composure while committing murder revealed the depth of his psychological pathology.
The girl jumped up. I almost sensed her in the dark get up and jumped over her mother as Steve was hacking away, and she jumped right into my arms. Okay. I stabbed her once towards the face. Then I went for the front as I was swinging her around, and she got free of my hand and went flying into the glass door, knocked her head, stopped crying completely.
Okay.
I figured she was probably toast.
Yeah.
Listening to Christopher describe attacking 11-year-old Jaimie was the hardest part of my career. The clinical way he recounted stabbing a child who had literally jumped into his arms, seeking protection, challenged every instinct I had as both a police officer and a human being. She jumped right into my arms. Jaimie Cates, in the darkness and chaos, had mistakenly run toward one of her attackers, thinking he might be someone who could help her. Instead, she found herself face to face with a monster who would stab her in the face without hesitation.
The mom was still gurgling and kind of breathing deeply. Steve just went at her. I was actually kind of scared of him. He just kept hacking at the bed, came over to our side and hacked at it some more.
Yeah.
And then went over and kicked the girl a couple times with his steel-toe boots, and then hit her in the head with the machete. Or at least so he said he did aim for the head.
Yeah.
I was backing off because I knew Steve was losing it. I could tell. Then he turned around, he looked like Jason from Halloween, with the machete in his hand. And I told him, Steve, relax, it's just me, it's Chris.
Christopher's description of Steven's behavior suggested someone in a complete psychological break. What forensic psychologists call a dissociative episode. The comparison to Jason from Halloween was apt. Steven had become something inhuman, driven by pure bloodlust. But what was almost more disturbing was Christopher's relative composure during this rampage. While Steven was lost in violence, Christopher maintained enough presence of mind to worry about his own safety, to analyze Steven's behavior, and to eventually talk him down. This suggested a level of psychological control that made his participation in the violence all the more calculated.
He was breathing hard and relaxed, and Quinn had the good sense to go turn the breakers back on and the lights on.
Yeah.
Indeed, one witness, Quinn, later testified he could not comprehend the horror unfolding before him when Steven turned violent that night.
When the mother woke up, she made a comment. She said, Jaimie crying or something, that then you covered your ears and ran.
I didn't run, I walked.
Walked out of the room, okay? That's because you knew what the purpose was to be there?
I guess I didn't believe it was really happening. I was shocked that people were home. I was shocked that this was actually happening, and I walked down the hallway because I didn't want to face the reality.
Christopher's claim that he didn't want to face the reality was a fascinating insight into his psychology. Even as he participated in brutal murder, part of his mind was trying to distance itself from the horror. This wasn't incompatible with his sociopathic diagnosis. People with antisocial personality disorder can understand intellectually that something is wrong even if they don't feel appropriate emotional responses. Quinn's reaction, covering his ears and leaving the room, was more typical of how a normal person would respond to such violence. The fact that Christopher felt the need to clarify that he walked rather than ran showed his concern with appearing weak or cowardly. What Christopher told us about the immediate aftermath of the murders was almost as disturbing as the crimes themselves. These weren't remorseful teenagers struggling with the weight of what they had done. They were excited predators already planning their next move.
Yeah.
I'll be perfectly honest, I wanted to kill someone for a long time. It's like an urge, and it was kind of a time that I could get it out.
Rarely do murderers confess in such detail, but this type of admission offers crucial insight into someone with severe antisocial personality disorder. Christopher's admission that he had wanted to kill someone for a long time was the key to understanding everything that had happened. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or even a robbery gone wrong. This was the fulfillment of a long-held fantasy. The Cates family had simply been unlucky enough to be available when Christopher decided to act on his urges. In all my years in law enforcement, I had never heard such a direct admission of murderous intent. Most killers claim they snapped, acted in self-defense, or were under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Christopher was telling us that he had always wanted to kill, and the Mont Vernon attack had simply been his opportunity.
I thought at least I would feel bad about it. I'm almost sorry to say I don't. I'm not sure why. I thought I would at least puke afterwards or something, after looking at her with her forearm open with the bone showing.
When you say her, you mean the woman? Yeah.
Stabbing the girl as she was saying, please don't do this. Because the mom was...
Who was saying, please don't do this?
The girl. The little girl.
The little girl.
And the mom was like, it'll be okay. I think her mom probably hoped that we weren't going to hurt the little girl because she was a little girl.
The detail about Kimberly telling Jaimie, it'll be okay, in her final moments exemplified everything noble about motherhood. Even as she was being brutally murdered, Kimberly Cates was trying to comfort her daughter, trying to maintain hope in the face of unimaginable horror. Christopher's clinical description of Jaimie's injuries, her forearm open with a bone showing, and his admission that he felt nothing while looking at this devastation, revealed the complete absence of normal human empathy. Most people will be traumatized by witnessing such injuries, let alone causing them.
It was kind of cool because it was different.
Yep.
But not really sure if I have a conscience anymore.
Christopher likely relished retelling the crime, as it allowed him to relive the thrill and articulate his emotions and thought process. It was kind of cool because it was different. Those words will haunt me forever. Christopher wasn't just admitting to murder. He was expressing enjoyment of it. The novelty of the experience, the power over life and death, the ultimate violation of another human being. These weren't sources of guilt or trauma for him. They were entertainment. His uncertainty about whether he still had a conscience suggested some level of self-awareness about his psychological state. But rather than being concerned about this moral emptiness, he seemed almost curious about it, like a scientist studying an interesting specimen.
Steve had mentioned that we weren't going to have time to torture and that we'd do it some other time.
While Christopher showed intellectual cruelty, evidence suggests Steven was the more sadistic partner, orchestrating violence while Christopher provided cunning support.
I think Steve enjoys just the butchery part of it, just the power.
Yeah.
I'm more of a precision sort of guy. If I went in there to kill, I'm just going to kill him.
The casual mention of torture plans revealed that the Mont Vernon attack was never intended to be their final crime. These weren't teenagers who had made a terrible mistake. They were developing serial killers who were already planning their next victims. Christopher's self-description as more of a precision sort of guy showed his need to maintain a sense of superiority, even while confessing to murder. In his mind, he was a more refined killer than Steven, more professional and controlled. This grandiosity is typical of individuals with antisocial personality disorder.
Steve was pretty much excited, but it definitely wasn't his first time. It was like, yeah, it's awesome. You'll get used to it, Chris. It gets addicting, but we'll take care of it.
Yep.
Even Christopher's friend Autumn later recalled Steven's volatile temperament and how he could suddenly erupt in aggression.
Steve had always talked about doing shootings and killing people and said he'd killed a lot of people and he had got a lot of respect on the streets and whatever. And he'd always said he wanted to kill someone to know what it felt like.
Steven's claim that it definitely wasn't his first time raised terrifying questions about other potential victims. While we never found evidence of previous murders, the possibility that these teenagers had killed before and might have killed again, if not caught, added urgency to every aspect of our investigation. The description of killing as addicting was consistent with what forensic psychologists know about certain types of serial killers. For individuals with severe antisocial personality disorder, the power and control involved in taking a life can indeed become psychologically addictive. As we continued gathering evidence, we discovered that Steven and Christopher's murderous intentions hadn't been completely secret. Several of their friends had heard them discuss violence, but had dismissed it as teenage bravado. The tragedy was that multiple people had opportunities to prevent this crime, but didn't recognize the genuine danger these boys represented. Autumn's account confirmed that Steven's fascination with violence was more than teenage bravado.
I just knew Steve was getting worse from talking to him. And then at some point, he went away. I don't know exactly where. When he came back, he was not the same person. He wasn't that emo kid who had issues at home. He was this kid who wanted to be a gangster, a big drug dealer. Like, it was odd because somehow he always managed to have money for drugs. He would sneak out at night. He'd quote-unquote borrow his parents' cars.
Autumn Savoy's observations provided crucial insight into Steven's psychological deterioration. The transformation from emo kid with issues to someone who wanted to be a gangster represented a dangerous escalation in antisocial thinking and behavior. The fact that Steven suddenly had money for drugs and was borrowing his parents' cars suggested he was already engaging in criminal activity to fund his lifestyle. These were warning signs that, in retrospect, pointed clearly toward more serious crimes.
Steve had mentioned in the past that he wanted to kill his mom because there was a lot of animosity between them because she degraded him in his opinion. He was thinking very seriously and discussing with Chris Gribble about murdering his mother, Steven's mother.
Such obsession with murder and pleasure in the act itself is common in individuals with extreme antisocial personality traits. Steven's expressed desire to kill his own mother was perhaps the clearest warning sign that he posed a danger to society. The fact that he was discussing this seriously with Christopher showed that their friendship had become a mutual reinforcement system for violent fantasies. This revelation made me wonder how many other people Steven might have targeted if he hadn't been caught. His mother, other family members, random strangers, anyone could have become a victim of his escalating violence.
And Steve had mentioned before that he's killed multiple people. He said this one wasn't his first mom and daughter job either, but we were in the driveway.
Steven may have boasted of past killings to manipulate his peers, convincing them of his impunity and encouraging their participation. Steven's claims about previous murders were never verified, but they served a psychological purpose regardless of their truth. By presenting himself as an experienced killer, Steven established dominance within the group and reduced the others' inhibitions about participating in violence. This kind of false bravado is common among young criminals who want to appear more dangerous and experienced than they actually are. But in this case, the lies may have contributed to the group's willingness to commit real murder. Even more disturbing than the murders themselves was how the killers behaved in the hours and days following the attack. Rather than showing remorse or trying to turn themselves in, they engaged in an elaborate cover-up that showed just how callous and calculating they truly were. After the ordeal, Christopher and Steven went to Autumn's house around 5 a.m., where Autumn claimed ignorance of the crime's details, though his account contained inconsistencies.
I was looking at him, and I was like, "What do you want?" And he's like, "Nothing. I'm just amped. I've got a massive adrenaline rush right now." I was like, "Why?" He's like, "Oh, we just killed 2 people." Like, he said it really nonchalantly, and being Steve and his stories previously, I was like, "Yeah, okay." I didn't believe a word of what he said.
Steven's casual announcement of the murders, said really nonchalantly, showed a complete lack of appropriate emotional response. Most people will be traumatized, panicked, or at least nervous after committing such crimes. Steven was experiencing an adrenaline rush, as if he had just finished playing a video game rather than brutally murdering a mother and child. Autumn's initial disbelief was understandable given Steven's history of telling elaborate lies. Unfortunately, this meant that even when Steven was telling the truth about committing murder, people who might have reported him instead dismissed his words as more teenage fantasy.
Chris grabbed the bag of clothes and was carrying it, and Steve and I knew the path pretty well because that's where we used to go and smoke weed. And so we went down there. Steve and Chris were trying to decide who was going to throw the stuff into the river. And Steve's like, "Autumn, why don't you just throw it in?" And I was like, "All right." I was extremely disturbed as to the story which they were telling me. I became very, very nervous because from the detail, it just seemed to be incredibly real.
The disposal of evidence showed premeditation even after the fact. Rather than panicking or confessing, Christopher and Steven immediately began destroying evidence in a methodical way. They had changed clothes during the attack, brought the bloody clothing with them, and had a plan for disposal. Autumn's agreement to throw the evidence in the river made him an accessory after the fact. Even if he didn't fully believe the murders had actually occurred, his nervousness suggested that on some level, he knew he was helping to cover up a real crime. Attempting to erase evidence, they planned to burn what remained, but Autumn suggested dumping it in the Nashua River instead. Ironically, Autumn later led police directly to the discarded items, despite insisting he had no prior knowledge of the plot. The irony that Autumn would later lead us to the evidence he had helped dispose of was not lost on me. In trying to help his friends cover up their crime, he had inadvertently preserved crucial evidence that would help convict them. This pattern, criminals making mistakes while trying to be clever, is common in my experience. The stress and paranoia of covering up a major crime often leads to errors that ultimately ensure the perpetrators are caught. The trial phase of the Mont Vernon case was both a relief and a continued nightmare. Relief because we finally had the chance to seek justice for Kimberly Cates and her daughter Jaimie. A nightmare because every detail of the evidence had to be presented in court, forcing everyone involved to relive the horror again and again. Both Steven and Christopher were convicted of first-degree murder and received life sentences without parole. Although the U.S. Supreme Court later ruled against mandatory life without parole for minors, Steven astonishingly chose not to appeal, a decision upheld by the New Hampshire Supreme Court. He claimed he was too twisted to deserve a second chance. Steven's decision not to appeal his life sentence was perhaps the only moment of honesty and self-awareness he had shown throughout the entire case. His acknowledgement that he was the most sick and twisted person you'll ever meet was a rare instance of a criminal accurately assessing his own danger to society. In my experience, most convicted killers maintain their innocence or blame others for their crimes. Steven's acceptance of his sentence suggested that even he understood the magnitude of what he had done and recognized that he couldn't be trusted in society. William Marks and Quinn Glover, who did nothing to stop the attack on Kimberly and Jaimie, may be eligible for parole in coming years. Quinn faces release on his robbery charge in 2029, while William becomes eligible in 2024. Autumn Savoy was granted parole in 2015. The disparity in sentences between the main perpetrators and their accomplices reflected the legal reality that different levels of participation warrant different punishments. But from an emotional standpoint, knowing that some of the people who had been present during Jaimie and Kimberly's murders would eventually walk free was difficult to accept. Billy and Quinn's upcoming release dates serve as reminders that the criminal justice system, while imperfect, does distinguish between leaders and followers, between those who actively participate in violence and those who are present but don't directly cause harm. It's been over a decade since I worked the Mont Vernon case, and I've since retired from law enforcement. But the lessons I learned from that investigation continue to shape how I think about human nature, evil, and the fragile boundaries that separate civilization from chaos. Jaimie Cates survived her injuries and has grown into a remarkable young woman. Her courage, both in surviving the attack and in testifying at trial, represents everything good about the human spirit. She chose not to let the evil that touched her life define her future. The case taught me that evil doesn't always look like what we expect. Christopher Gribble was an Eagle Scout from a religious family. Steven Spader was a troubled teenager whose parents had tried everything to get him help. These weren't monsters living in the shadows. They were boys who lived among us, went to our schools, and participated in our communities. But perhaps the most important lesson was about the power of small decisions. Multiple people heard Steven and Christopher talk about violence and chose to dismiss it as teenage bravado. Alarm systems failed at crucial moments. Parents struggled to get help for troubled children and were failed by systems that couldn't or wouldn't provide adequate intervention. The Mont Vernon massacre wasn't inevitable, but it was the result of a series of small failures that combined into perfect conditions for tragedy. Understanding that gives me hope that similar tragedies can be prevented. If we're willing to take warning signs seriously, if we're willing to intervene when we see troubled young people heading down dark paths, and if we're willing to acknowledge that sometimes evil is real and must be stopped. Kimberly Cates died trying to protect her daughter. Her final words were an attempt to comfort Jaimie in the face of unimaginable terror. That kind of love, fierce, protective, selfless, is what I choose to remember from this case. Not the darkness of what Christopher and Steven did, but the light of what Kimberly represented and what Jaimie became. In a world where monsters like the disciples of destruction can exist, we need more people like Kimberly Cates. People who choose love over fear, protection over self-preservation, hope over despair. The battle between good and evil doesn't take place in some cosmic arena. It takes place in moments of choice, in acts of courage, in decisions to care for one another, even when it's dangerous to do so. That's the real lesson of Mont Vernon. Evil is real, but it doesn't get the last word. Love does.